Undercover boss learns waitress works 60 hours but still can't afford rent. Saturday morning. The wind was still, but the sun had already risen. Light streamed in through the large windows of Sunrise Junction, a small branch tucked at the edge of a working-class neighborhood where people came each morning looking for a bit of warmth from a hot cup of coffee and a slice of crisp toast. The door opened and closed quickly as always. The coffee machine roared behind the counter.
Orders were called out between the clatter of shoes running in the back kitchen.
Everything blended into a familiar rhythm, as if someone had already wound up a weekend morning symphony, steady, unhurried, never delayed. In the corner near the window, a man sat quietly. Gray hoodie, faded jeans, cap pulled low across his forehead. No one noticed who he was, and that was exactly what he intended. Michael Foster, 50 years old, founder and soul of the New Dawn coffee and toast chain, a brand that started with a mobile coffee cart on the streets of New York, now present in cities across the country. But this morning, he wasn't in a high-rise office. He wasn't here to give a speech or cut a ribbon. He simply returned to a small branch that had been sending odd reports for the past month, good sales, but constant staff turnover. Morning shifts always understaffed. Michael came like a regular customer. No advance notice. No secretary. No regional manager in tow. Just a notebook, a pen, and one question in his mind. Why is it that the place considered the most stable is where the most people choose to walk away a young waitress approach? Ponytail tied loosely with a rubber band. Uniform slightly wrinkled at the cuffs. She placed a coffee in front of him along with a line she'd likely said hundreds of times: black coffee, no sugar. Hope you have a good day. Michael looked up, smiled, then asked in a deep, calm voice, free of pressure, long shift today. She hesitated as if no customer had ever asked her that before. But then she replied softly, like talking to herself, yeah, this is my 6th shift this week. Around 60 hours total. But still not sure if I'll make rent this month. There was no desperation in her tone, no sigh, no pleading eyes, just a bare truth, exposed, unguarded, like someone too used to living with numbers that never add up, and that was what made Michael feel cold inside. He didn't respond immediately. His hand still stirred the spoon gently in the cup. But it had stopped mid-motion, not out of shock, but out of shame. Shame because he was the one who once wrote in his notebook a line he believed was a lifelong principle: a real company doesn't just sell products. It sells peace of mind to those who work there. And now, with just one sentence, still not sure if I'll make rent this month, that entire value suddenly became a question. He looked up, looked at the girl. Young, thin, but in her eyes, no anger. Only quiet resignation, like a leaf too familiar with the wind. And that was the scariest thing of all. Not the storm, but the silence before it, where people have gotten used to injustice as if it were normal. Michael didn't ask more, but he wrote the first line in his notebook: 6th shift. 60 hours. Still not enough for rent. She said it like she was saying the sun is out. At that moment, across the caf, a middle-aged man returned his receipt, along with a $5 bill. For the young waitress, he said kindly. She nodded in thanks. But instead of pocketing the bill or placing it in a private drawer, she turned around and walked to a glass jar near the espresso machine labeled "Shared Tips Divided Weekly." She dropped the bill in, glanced around, then returned, grabbed a rag, and continued wiping tables, saying nothing more. Michael wrote the second line personal tip, but didn't keep it. Because of someone's eyes behind the counter. No clear problem had been identified yet. No major issue to name. But he knew. It's often the smallest details that reveal a broken system. Beneath the calm of Sunrise Junction, something was cracking. Not the equipment, but trust. And it all began with words that seemed harmless, like what she'd just said. Michael took a sip of coffee, not because he needed caffeine, but to swallow the lump rising in his throat. Sunrise Junction, one of the smallest, most remote branches in the entire New Dawn coffee and toast system. The shop sat nestled in a working-class neighborhood where most customers were construction workers, delivery drivers, janitors, or single mothers starting their day at 5 a.m. The storefront was modest. No bright LED signs, just a wooden board with hand-carved words, "Start your day with something kind." Inside glowed warm yellow lights, worn oak furniture, the faint smell of toasted bread drifting through the cracks in the door. A small bar sat to the left. Behind it, an open kitchen where the sizzle of eggs on the pan blended with the gentle clink of coffee cups. Michael Foster, founder of New Dawn, was sitting quietly in the far corner of the cafe, holding a cup of black coffee, no sugar. He had been there for 3 consecutive mornings, not as a CEO, but as a new regular who had just moved into the neighborhood. Few people paid attention to the salt and pepper-haired man.
And that was just how he wanted it.
About 3 weeks ago, the HR department began receiving a string of strange reports. The number of employees quitting at Sunrise Junction was nearly double that of branches of similar size. A few anonymous emails complained about sudden shift changes, unfair tip distribution, and a suffocating tension during morning shifts. Michael didn't send a supervisor. He didn't open an internal investigation. Instead, he chose to show up, quietly, silently, and observe. In those 3 days, he noticed many things. The first was a girl named Sarah.
Sarah, 26 years old, petite-build hair, always neatly tied, fast steps.
She was the one who brought his coffee every morning. Never late. Always polite. Always behind the counter by 5:45 a.m., even though her shift officially began at 6:00. One thing kept repeating. After customers left and tables were cleared, Sarah would often crouch behind the counter not to grab a cleaning cloth, but to adjust a gray fabric bag tucked carefully behind the mini fridge. Once Michael clearly saw the corner of a toothbrush sticking out. Another time he heard the soft sound of a zipper when she thought no one was paying attention. He didn't ask, but he wrote in his notebook, "Someone who shows up at 5:45 but never arrives empty-handed." The second person who stood out was Josh, the morning shift manager. Around 30. Leather shoes, crisp shirt, always pacing between tables with a clipboard in hand. He checked everything: clock-ins, order counts, weekly schedules. But Michael noticed he didn't always make eye contact with the staff, especially not with Sarah. On Monday morning, an elderly customer left a $10 bill after an espresso. When Sarah reached to pick it up, Josh came straight from the counter, hand extended, handed over. "Goes in the shared tip jar." Sarah paused. She looked at the customer. He nodded, as if signaling, "You keep it." But she just smiled faintly, then placed the bill in the glass jar on the counter labeled "Shared Tips Collected Weekly." Michael noticed no one ever received a tip summary, and no one was allowed to ask. Rita, the head cook, was the only one older than Sarah on the morning team. Around 50. Graying hair. Calloused hands. She always called Sarah my girl, but every time Josh stepped into the kitchen, Rita went quiet and looked down. One time, while Michael stood at the order counter, he overheard a short exchange. "Could I pick up a night shift this week? My rent just went up another $150. I'll ask Josh, but don't get your hopes up." The air turned heavy after that sentence. On the 3rd day, Michael waited for Sarah after her shift. From the window, he saw her walk behind the cafe, not toward the main parking lot, but around a side path across a small patch of grass where a few old cars were parked haphazardly. She opened the door of a faded hatchback, climbed into the back seat, and shut the door. She didn't turn the engine on, didn't start the car. She just sat there. Michael sat still, his eyes fixed on the glass. And in those few seconds, he remembered himself at 24, sleeping in the back of his first coffee truck during a Bronx winter because he couldn't afford to rent a space. But he had chosen that life to start a business. This girl, she was just trying to survive. Michael closed the notebook, not because there was no space left, but because it was time to stop writing. That morning, the cafe was busier than usual. The air was chilly. People walked in with thick coats, hands in pockets, hoping for a hot cup of coffee to start their day. Sarah, as always, was the first to arrive and the last to leave the counter. Michael sat at his usual table in the corner by the wall. No laptop, no newspaper, no notes. Just sitting there as if he were part of the air, quietly watching every motion unfolding before him. From behind the counter, he saw Sarah tiptoe to reach the sugar box on the top shelf. She stretched her arm, but it trembled slightly. As she set the box down, she gently rubbed her neck, an unconscious gesture of someone sleep-deprived and carrying long-term stress. Michael waited until the crowd thinned out. He asked for a refill and said, "Take a seat for a bit." Just a few minutes. Sarah hesitated. Then she nodded and pulled out the chair across from him. There was no sound except the coffee grinder and the soft hum of an old country song playing on the radio. Michael looked into his cup, then asked gently, "What time do you go home?" The question sounded casual. Soft. Non-threatening. But when he looked up at Sarah, he saw her gaze slow down.
Sarah smiled.
But it wasn't a smile of ease. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they've had to choose answers that make others uncomfortable too many times. "I'm staying in my car." Behind the bus stop across the street. She said it as if she were sharing something trivial, like mentioning it's sunny today. "Doesn't matter if I leave early or late. No one's waiting for me anyway." Michael didn't respond.
His throat tightened.
Partly out of surprise. Partly because it didn't surprise him anymore. This wasn't the first time he'd heard of an employee sleeping in their car. But there was something different about Sarah, something that struck him deeper than the other times. She said it with no hint of hope. No complaint. No attempt to evoke pity. Just stated it. Like a simple, undeniable truth. That's what unsettled him the most. An emotional drop that didn't come from tears, but from the way a young woman working 60 hours a week had stopped feeling anything when talking about not having a home. Beneath the clean uniform, Sarah carried a weariness no one could touch. Not physical exhaustion, but the kind that lives in your mind when you know you're slowly drowning and no one turns around to find you. Michael gently squeezed the hand resting under the table. He leaned forward, keeping his voice calm. "How long have you been working here?" Sarah looked up, a little surprised by the question. "I started last year. February. At first I just asked for part-time, but later the morning shift needed someone. So I took it. And now 10 hours a day. 6 days a week. And still not enough to afford rent." Sarah shook her head and gave a faint smile. "A tiny studio around here is up to $1,250 now. And that's the kind with no kitchen, no real heating." Michael exhaled slowly. That's when he realized the issue wasn't just a bad manager. It was a system not asking the right questions. We ask employees, "Did you clock in on time? Is your uniform clean? Did you smile at the customers?" But we don't ask, "Do you have a place to sleep tonight?" Sarah stood up, nodded politely as if to apologize. "I should get back to work." "Thanks for asking." Michael nodded. As she walked away, he noticed the worn-out heel on her left shoe. The fabric was sticking out. And the back hem of her shirt was crumpled like it had been stuffed into a backpack many times before being worn. Once again, he opened his notebook. Not to write down her words, but to write one single question for himself. How did we let this happen inside a brand that carries the word Dawn? The story at this point was no longer inside a small cafe on the outskirts of town. It had moved beyond location, beyond address, and into the conscience of a founder. A founder who once swore he would never let anyone sacrifice their dignity just to keep a part-time job. That afternoon, after the morning rush had passed, Michael was still sitting at his usual table, as if he were a quiet part of the cafe's busy picture. Sarah was wiping down the counter. Her movements were neat, steady. But from behind, Michael saw her figure slightly hunched, not from fatigue, but from habit. From the habit of lowering one's head. He poured more water into his third cup of coffee for the day, then started chatting with others in the tone of a casual, regular, "How's work here, all right?" he asked Maya, a barista with brown hair around 28. She glanced around, then lowered her voice. "The job's not bad." But fairness, that's lacking. Lacking how Josh controls most of the tips. Customers hand them straight to Sarah, but he always says, according to policy, put it in the shared jar. And everyone sees some people get more than others. No one says it out loud, but by the way he gathers the tips, it's obvious. Michael gave a small nod. The delivery kid, curly hair, barely in his 20s, murmured as he passed Sarah works the longest shifts. But just one time, when she asked to take a morning off for a doctor's visit, her hours got cut the following week. No notice, nope. She only found out when the schedule came out. Michael leaned back slightly, his eyes following the slow-turning ceiling fan. He was connecting the scattered pieces, and then another piece appeared from the shift assignment book sitting on the cashier shelf. He didn't touch it, just looked long enough to see Sarah's name was frequently removed from peak hour slots. Early Saturday mornings when it was crowded, late Sunday afternoons when tips were high. Her name was almost never there. A full-time employee working 6 days a week, yet always standing in the margins of the system. Her shadow never reached the light where opportunity lived.
Michael slowly opened his phone.
In the system, he found an email Sarah had sent 2 weeks prior. Subject request to add evening shifts. The reply was brief and cold. If you can't handle the current schedule, maybe it's best to step down early. Josh, no greeting. No sign off. No hello. No thanks. Just one sentence, as if replying to an apology, not a request to work more.
Michael closed his eyes for a moment. Sarah's voice echoed in his mind from that conversation about sleeping in her car. Doesn't matter if I leave early or late.
Not because she wanted to stay at the cafe, not because she was addicted to work, but because there was no home to return to. And to Josh, she was still seen as not flexible enough. Michael looked up. He started noticing smaller things once. When Sarah received a personal tip from an elderly customer, she hesitated for a few seconds, then looked toward Josh, who was returning behind the counter, and quietly dropped the bill into the shared jar. Another time, as she passed the storage room, he noticed her subtly pull her sleeve down, covering a faint bruise on her wrist. No one asked, and Sarah never said a word. Each fragmented piece, the quiet comments, cautious glances, suppressed actions, slowly came together into a clear truth. Sarah wasn't poor because she was lazy. She was poor because the system had decided one thing: those who stay silent can endure more. Michael stood up and walked slowly toward the board where the work schedule was posted. The names of those scheduled for Sunday morning, the busiest shift, were highlighted. Sarah's name wasn't there. He turned back to the cafe, looked at Josh chatting and smiling with customers, at Maya making drinks, at Sarah using a napkin to carefully clean a metal tray so meticulous it could reflect a mirror image. An employee like that, unable to afford rent, no one in his chain, should end the day sliding into a car seat, resting their head on the steering wheel just to sleep. He pulled out a pen and wrote a few lines in his black notebook, but not instructions, not criticism. Just a question, one he would have to answer while looking in the mirror. If I stay silent, how am I any different from them Sunday morning? The sky was overcast. In front of Sunrise Junction, people steadily came and went, workers in uniform, drivers, picking up takeout regulars, ordering the same things as always. Inside the cafe, Michael Foster had been sitting there since early. Old hoodie. Untouched black coffee. But this time, he wasn't sitting still. When the bell above the door rang for the 5th time, he put down his cup and stood up. The dim morning light through the glass stretched his shadow across the tiled floor. The entire cafe paused for a few seconds. Michael walked to the center of the counter. His voice wasn't loud, but each word rang out clearly. Can someone tell me who's in charge of scheduling and tip distribution here? Everything stopped. Josh looked up from behind the register, eyebrows narrowing slightly as if he didn't understand. That would be me. Is something wrong? Michael didn't answer right away. He turned his gaze, settling slowly on Sarah. She was behind the counter, placing 2 takeaway cups onto a tray. But her hands trembled slightly, not because the cups were hot, but because in that moment she knew something had just changed. Michael took a breath, then said, because I genuinely don't understand. How Can someone working 60 hours a week, arriving first, leaving last, be forced to choose between a sandwich or a night without getting kicked out of a parking lot? A strange silence spread through the room. No one spoke. It was as if the entire calf held its breath. Maya, who had been wiping a glass, set down the cloth. A middle-aged customer paused mid-call. Even the delivery guy at the door looked up. Josh let out a soft laugh, trying to stay composed. Money tips shifts. There are policies. We distribute based on performance flexibility, and Michael cut him off. Not loudly, but firmly enough to make Josh stop. What kind of performance justifies the fact that she skipped dinner 3 nights in a row just to pay the power bill on time? No one laughed. No one dared sip their coffee.
Sarah still stood there trying to keep a neutral expression, but her lips were pressed tight.
Michael recognized it. That's the face of someone used to swallowing their pride. She wasn't expecting to be defended.
She was just trying not to cry in front of customers.
Michael turned back to Josh, eyes no longer gentle. And what kind of flexibility allows a manager to cut someone's hours just because they asked to go see a doctor? Josh started to say something, but the eyes around the room had already spoken. A cook near the kitchen doorway folded his hands together. An elderly customer gently tugged at her husband's sleeve. Maya stood straighter, eyes locked on Josh. Michael looked around, then spoke slowly. Sarah has done enough. She doesn't need to prove anything anymore. And at that moment, something unexpected happened. Sarah turned her face away, but a tear fell onto her hand just as she was holding the final cup. She didn't wipe it away immediately, and Michael saw it, a salty droplet, small but enough to break through every act of bravery. At that same moment, a customer, a truck driver, set his cup down and walked out. Not in anger, but because he didn't want to witness someone being pushed so far and still forced to smile. The entire calf sank into another kind of silence, no longer suspicion, but awakening. Michael took a step back as if giving the stage to the truth. He didn't need to raise his voice, because the system was already speaking through expressions, through the tiny daily details people had ignored. He pulled a card from his wallet but didn't hand it over yet. Instead, he said, "We can sell millions of cups of coffee a year. But if the person serving it has to sleep in her car, then this brand is brewing injustice." Then he turned to Josh. "I won't say more. But you'll have to answer not just to me, to everyone in this room."
Starting with an explanation to Sarah.
Josh bowed his head. For the first time in his years as a manager, there was no confidence. No excuse. Only smallness in front of a truth that could no longer be hidden. And in Sarah's eyes, for the first time, there was a tear not from shame, but because someone finally stood up. Michael quietly slipped his hand into his coat pocket. No one moved. Every eye in the CAF staff and customers alike seemed to realize this moment would not be like anything they had seen before. He pulled out a card and placed it on the wooden counter in front of Josh. "Michael Foster. I'm the founder of New Dawn." For a second, Josh didn't understand.
His lips moved, but no sound came out.
Then his face turned pale. A cold breeze seemed to pass through the space, not from the air conditioner, but from the undeniable truth now standing in plain sight. No one spoke, but Maya froze in mid-wipe. The middle-aged customer turned to his wife and whispered something. Sarah still stood at the counter, her hand holding the stainless steel coffee pot, but her back had straightened as if she no longer needed to shrink. Michael spoke slowly. "I want to review last week's security footage and the shift schedules since the beginning of the month." Josh hesitated. But then, as if knowing he had no other choice, he opened the computer. Michael leaned in. No one interrupted, as if everyone was witnessing a trial without a judge. The first clip appeared a customer handed Sarah a tip directly with sincere eyes, clear words of thanks. But just seconds later, Josh walked over and pointed at the glass jar company policy. He took the bill from her hand and dropped it into the shared tip jar. The second clip, Sarah approached Josh, handed him a small note, clearly a shift change request for personal reasons. Josh smirked, stuffed the note into his desk drawer, and never responded. Michael didn't blink. He followed every detail, his face calm, but his eyes had changed, deeper, colder, and unforgiving.
He switched to the shift schedule.
Peak days, Friday, Saturday holidays, Sarah's name was absent. She was pushed into midweek morning shifts, low traffic, low tips. While those who were on good terms with Josh got near automatic priority, Michael opened another folder in the HR system and paused at a single email sent by Josh 2 weeks ago.
The subject line was unremarkable.
But the message stopped him cold. She complains too much. Cut her hours. Teach her a lesson. Michael read the line out loud. Only 6 words. But the weight of them fell on the calf like a slap no one could dodge. Josh started to sweat. He stammered, I just wanted to keep order during shifts. There were too many complaints. If people made their own decisions, Michael no longer looked at him. He turned his gaze toward Sarah. Order, Hugh, he repeated. His voice wasn't loud, but every syllable rang clear in the thick atmosphere. Sarah works 60 hours a week. Never late, never misses a shift. Still has to sleep in her car.
Still smiles at every customer.
And you call that order? Josh lowered his head. But Michael wasn't speaking to him anymore. He was speaking to the entire calf. If order means an employee has to hide a toothbrush and mouthwash behind the counter, has to choose between dinner or a safe night in a parking lot, then it's not order. It's helplessness of the system. And of those given power, they don't deserve.
Sarah still stood still.
But her hands no longer trembled. Maya put down her cup, her eyes silent yet lit with something unmistakable. For the first time, someone stood up. Michael exhaled softly. He turned to Josh, not angry anymore, just deeply disappointed. You thought no one would notice these things. You were wrong. I didn't build New Dawn to create an empire. I built it so people like Sarah could live with dignity earned through their own hard work. He paused for a moment, then added in a low voice, and I don't need you to redefine the word order for me. Josh had nothing more to say. Neither did anyone else. Only the steady hum of the coffee machine remained, like the very people this system had ignored. That very afternoon, no press conference, no sirens. Just quiet actions as clear as the ticking of a second hand. Josh was suspended right there in the calf. An internal email was sent from the main office at 2:13 p.m. confirming the decision and announcing the formation of an independent oversight team to audit tip distribution and shift assignments across the entire New Dawn chain within 30 days. No more excuses. No more internal policy. Every distorted line of data, every ignored email would be reviewed. And Sarah, the one who once stood silently at the coffee counter, stainless steel pot in hand, was invited into the temporary office in the back. Michael looked at her, not as a CEO, but as a man who had just touched the roughest part of the system he had created. We will sign a new contract official with a proper salary. And all withheld tips from before will be fully reimbursed.
Sarah hadn't yet responded.
Michael gently pushed a white envelope toward her. It wasn't thick, but inside was 3 months of housing support, enough so she would never again have to call a parking lot her safe shelter. She opened her mouth to say something, but tears had already welled up, making her lips tremble. She didn't sob. She tilted her head slightly, inhaled deeply, as if to hold on to the dignity the system had stripped away piece by piece. Michael stood up. He didn't touch her shoulder. He simply walked away, leaving space for healing. Back at the counter, he grabbed a small slip of paper, taped it next to the coffee machine, right where every employee would see it every single day. 60 hours a week should not end with sleep in a car. No frame. No plaque. Just a few handwritten words taped up with clear tape, but in the right place. At the right time. The calf stayed open. But the air had changed. Maya started smiling as she poured milk into a cup. Another employee, for the first time in weeks, asked Sarah if she wanted to switch to an earlier shift this weekend to get some rest. Michael didn't leave through the front door. He walked around the back where the parking lot sat quietly under the late afternoon sun. At the small porch behind the store next to the emergency exit, he saw Sarah sitting there. She wasn't sitting there waiting for a ride.
She wasn't hugging her backpack, wasn't propping up a pillow to lean on.
She was just sitting her back, resting gently against the wooden wall, sunlight spilling across her shoulders, a sandwich in hand, fresh from the kitchen, given by a fellow employee. She didn't look around. She didn't look down. Her eyes were gazing straight ahead into a stretch of sky at the end of the day, a blue no longer harsh, but softened like life itself had just been returned to its proper shape. No one came over to hug her. No one patted her shoulder. No one said sorry on behalf of the system, because that system finally had bowed its head through action. Michael quietly walked toward his car. He opened his notebook, flipped to a blank page, just one small corner left unwritten. And he wrote, "Not a mission statement. Not a tagline for the next quarterly meeting. Just a short line, but this time he wrote it in bolder ink than usual. Work shouldn't steal your home. No job, no matter how demanding, should ever take away the roof of the person doing it.